Bang! Neeves Knives. I'm Jared, and this is 5 knives with bad geometry and 5 knives with good geometry. Now, I'm not saying either one are the best or the worst. I'm just saying they're 5 knives from each category. Now, before we get started, yes, this is a clone. The real deal is a very, very expensive knife, and I do not recommend or condone clones. This was a gift and it's just for fun. This is, I think it's about $50. It's not over $1,000 like a real Reese, Reese Wieland Fatty Slash. So I just want to get that out of the, right off the bat. I just want to say that. Now it's here to represent bad geometry. As you can see, holy cow, that is thick. It is as thick as a titanium Spyro. A Nasher Knife Titanium Spyro. Extremely thick. Now, there's no possible way for this thing to get down to a thin edge. It's just not possible, even with a deep hollow grind. But there is so much more to it than just that when we're talking about blade geometry. Now, what's a good representation of good geometry? Good geometry is something like a chef knife. Now, this is the Twosun chef knife. I think it's the TS999 or something like that, but you can find it just by looking up Twosun chef knife, 14C28N. But a good representation or a good idea of good geometry is when you look at a chef knife, because they're usually very thin on the stock, very thin blade stock, and they're usually tall. And then going from the blade stock to the edge is a very slow transition. If it was rapid, if it was really fast, it would be like an axe, or kind of like how we were showing with this, very rapid down to the edge, because it has to be. Now, if we're talking about hollow grinds and things like that, it's a little bit different. You can get down to that edge a little faster with a hollow grind. But when we're talking about a flat grind, it needs as slow as it can be transition from the spine to the cutting edge. And being very thin, it's going to be like a laser going through things, especially when you can get down to a very thin edge. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be very thin behind the edge. And looking at a chef knife, no, it's not going to be a tough knife. It's not going to be good for prying. It's not going to be good for chopping or anything like that. But it is going to be about the best representation of a good slicing knife. So it's just a good idea of what does great geometry look like. Because when we're talking about great geometry, we're talking about being able, when we're talking about good cutting geometry, we're talking about good geometry for passing through materials, passing through dense materials. But saying good geometry, that's a broad spectrum, because it could be good geometry for toughness, it could be good geometry for hard use, it could be good geometry for chopping, it could be good geometry for prying, or it can be good geometry for slicing. So it depends on what we're talking about when we're talking about geometry. Like, what is it for? Now, when we talk about blade geometry, we need to think about the size of the knife, the blade shape, that is very important, the blade shape, and the ergos. The ergos is extremely, extremely important. And then next is the locking mechanism and the build, like the build strength, not just the build quality, but the build strength, the stop pin size, the hardware, the thickness of the lock bar or the scales, or, the liners. So let's get into the bad geometry first. And starting this off, we will start this off with the CEO. This is a CRKT CEO. Now, why does this have bad geometry? Well, one, it has a very thick blade stock. Now, we need to consider one thing. What is this made for? Because that is the biggest question you always need to ask when you're looking at geometry. What is that knife made for? This knife is made to be a letter opener. Made to be a letter opener, maybe cut open some packages and open mail and things like that. It's not made for anything more than that. So it's never going to be your recycling knife or your rope cutting knife or anything like that. So it doesn't really hurt it to have thick geometry, but it definitely doesn't help it either. And being a thin pen-like knife in the hand, you cannot get a good grip on this. There's no reason that it has this thick of geometry. One, it starts off with a very thick grind, and then it has to get down to its cutting edge from right here. So it only has this far to get down to a cutting edge. Bad geometry. They should have started this off with a very thin blade stock and it'd be much more slicey. Now, it doesn't really hurt it because it's not made to really do anything crazy, and you know, you don't really need good geometry to cut open a letter, but you know, it definitely doesn't do it any justice having bad geometry. Next, the Zero Tolerance ZT-0450. Now, ZT is known for making hard use knives with thicker grinds, you know, and this is basically that too, but it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because you can't get good grip on this. This is a 3.5 finger knife. It's thin, compact, and a small knife. It's not a big knife. So you can never get a good grip on this. You're never going to have great ergos with this thing. It's just uncomfortable in the hand. So you can never do long-term cutting with this. Then they put a thick grind on this. Look at how thick and robust that tip is. And then it has to get down to the cutting edge from this thick, starting right here. Not a full flat, starting halfway down the blade. So it only has this far to get down to a cutting edge. So it's thick behind the edge, and it has a flat grind too. If it had a hollow grind, it might be different, but it's just way too robust of a grind for the type of grip you can get. Now, some would argue that it's kind of a multi-use knife or a multi-tool type of knife where it's supposed to be able to do multiple tasks. And maybe that's so, but in that case, it shouldn't be as uncomfortable as it is, because it doesn't have the type of ergos that you would want to actually do anything tough with it. So in that case, it has very bad geometry. The Zero Tolerance 0450. Next, another one very similar. The Benchmade 940. Now, this is the -1 and S90V, and I am going to have a little bit of an argument for its size, or side. It is kind of supposed to be a multi-tool, you know, kind of like I was saying with the ZT-0450, but in this case, you actually can get a pretty good grip with it. Now, if you look at the blade stock, you can see how thick and robust it is. And then when we go down to the tip is like a swedge. So this tip is basically made to do very, very light duty prying. Nothing big, nothing hard, just little light duty prying stuff. And I'm not telling you to do that because it will void your warranty, I'm sure. But a lot of knives are made to do that. A lot of knives. You know, a lot of knife makers realize that their knives are a tool, and knives are made to be on the job site and do construction and do farming and do all different types of tasks. And some of them do need to be tougher than others. And this does have the type of blade shape and handle shape that you would want for that type of knife. But it's, you know, it's so short of a grind that it doesn't get down to a good cutting edge. Now, I guess you could say this is not supposed to be a good slicer. This is supposed to be able to just cut things when you need it and be tough all the way around the board. If you need to pry a little something, maybe you need to put it on something and tap the spine because it has a very, very strong lock. That's another good argument for its grind. It has an incredibly strong lock. The axis lock is, you know, very, very tough. However, for its size and everything, I mean, it is bad geometry. It does not cut very well. However, you can lay back the edge and get a little bit better cutting performance out of it. And it is a small, compact knife that you can be a little tougher on than other knives. So, you know, I do understand it. This is the Migu Run. I can't remember the name of it. I'll put it up on the screen. But this knife is a good example of a knife that they went all wrong with the geometry. It has a crazy thick blade stock. Then it has to get down to the cutting edge from halfway up the blade, not a full, and it's not hollow. So it's not a full flat grind and it's not a hollow. It's super thick behind the edge. Then when we come back here to the handle, yeah, it's thick. So yeah, it's okay in the hand. It's not the most comfortable, but it's not a knife I can really bear down on, and especially not for anything long term. This is going to be a knife that I pull out, I use once, and I put back in my pocket. Oh, you know, so why put this type of grind on it? And the handle, also the lock. The lock is a very weak lock. I'm not saying it's going to fail if I test it, but it's not a strong locking mechanism. It's a very thin liner, you know, very weak liner. So it's not made to do anything tough. From looking at the handle and the build, it's made to be a light duty knife. So why would you put a grind on it that's made for hard use? It just doesn't make sense. And if you look at my edge bevel, it looks like it's 15 degrees per side, but that's actually 20 degrees per side. But that's just how thick it is behind the edge. So this thing does not cut very well. And it's not built to be a multi-tool or built to do harder things that the blade makes it seem like it could do. Next and last, for the bad geometry, this is the Terzola Drop knife. Now I am going to stick up for it because Terzola makes tactical knives. He's actually the one that coined the phrase and invented the tactical knife. Now this is a compact version of his tactical knives. We is the one who did make it, but he's the designer, Bob Terzola. Now it's a spear point blade like his original tactical knife, with, you know, it's a smaller knife. His original one is a lot bigger and it has a hollow grind. This one has a flat grind instead of a hollow. It has a very thick blade stock and a very robust tip. Now, with a tactical knife, you want those things, right? But his original one has a hollow grind that does it. Now, this one's a flat. So it is made to be tougher, but it's just not as comfortable as it should be to be able to do those things. Now, you could say, well, it's supposed to be just somewhat tough, not like crazy tough. And I would say, yeah, maybe, you know, and in that case, you know, whatever. But it is a titanium liner lock. It is an awesome knife, but it does not cut very well. However, there are things you can do to improve the cutting performance on a knife, like laying back the edge. If you look at the edge, I laid this side back. This side is 15 degrees per side, and that's why the edge bevel is so big on it. Now, on the other side, I did it at like 22 degrees per side or something like that. So it'd be even more slicey if I laid back both sides, but also the edge wouldn't be as tough. So in order to keep the durability of the edge, you know, being that it's supposed to be a tough knife, and make it slicey, I laid back only one side, and man, it improved the cutting performance by 4 times. Like it improved it massively. So I'm very happy with the cutting performance now, but right off the bat, no, it has very bad geometry. In order to get geometry, you do have to put a crazy big edge bevel on it, you know, which some people would think it looks crazy. Now, I would argue another way to kind of not help that, but another way you could do it, you know, this way is one way, but there's always other ways. You can do a dual grind. So a dual grind is going to make it where, and by the way, I like this blade shape way better than I like this blade shape. This is just to represent another way. So another way is a dual grind, where you make it very thin at the cutting edge. So this is super thin right here. It's a very deep hollow. Now this has a thick blade stock. You can see it's very robust. Thin right here behind the edge, but then we get up to the tip and it's a flat grind instead of a hollow. This is a tip that is made to not break. It's made to do those light duty prying tasks while still having a nice thin edge right here for slicing, and very thin, you know, to push through materials while having good comfortable ergo. So you're going to be able to use it longer than you would a knife that's uncomfortable. Now, I'm not saying it's an all-day cutting knife like some knives are, but it's definitely a knife you could use a little bit longer term than others while still being able to, have durability up in the front of the blade and not worry about chipping and still keep it nice and slicey. Now, that's kind of what this was going for, except for it kind of hurt the slicing part. And this is not a knife you're going to be batoning. It's not a knife you're going to be doing crazy things with, considering the lock, the size, the ergos, and all those other things. Now let's get into some good geometry. And let's go through it quick because this video is getting long. First off, we have the Kizer Dukes, a light duty basic EDC knife. What is this knife made for? This knife is made for basic EDC tasks. Cutting rope, cutting cardboard, opening packages, great flipping action. So the handle is a 3-4. You get a full grip, I guess, but it's not a very comfortable full grip, but it's okay. Now, because it's not like the most comfortable grip, it needs thin, slicey geometry. And in this case, they knocked it out of the park. Nice, thin hollow grind, and it's almost a full hollow. I mean, it does have the swedge up here to reinforce a little strength behind the tip, but very, very slicey. It makes sense. Next. Now, say a little compact knife that's a little lockback that's made to be a knife you just take out of your pocket, make a cut, put it back in your pocket, does not need thick geometry. And this knife has a very thin blade stock. This is the Spyderco chaparral. Very tall flat grind, and like we were saying before, thin blade stock, and then it slowly gets down to its cutting edge. So this thing cuts incredibly well, especially considering you're not going to get the most comfortable grip on this thing. It's just not built for that. So since you're not going to get the most comfortable grip, it should have really good cutting performance to make up for its smallness. Next, we have the CIV Trailblazer. Now, the CIV Trailblazer is not a locking knife. It's a slip joint. It has a stop, and then right there, it's open. But it's very comfortable in the hand, and they basically made a non-locking knife as tough as it could be. It is a very tough grind while also being very, very slicey. Not a thick blade stock, nice thin blade stock while also having a nice tall, deep hollow grind that gets very thin behind the edge. So this knife is going to give you good ergos for long duty cutting and harder use cutting while also not compromising the geometry. It's going to have good geometry for cutting that matches the handle very, very well. This thing has amazing geometry for its build. Next, I'm actually going to pull out two to fit this category, but something thin, slim, something for basic EDC, maybe letter opening and cutting tape and packages and things like that. We have something that's thin, slim, compact in the hand. This one's a flat grind. This is the Real Steel G-frame, White Mountain Knives exclusive. But if you see, it's not going to be like something you're going to want to cut with all day. It's going to be a knife you take out, you make your cut, close it up, and you put it back. You might be able to do a little bit longer duty cutting with it because it has amazing geometry. So it's making up for its ergos with the geometry. Nice thin blade stock, thin behind the edge, tall flat grind. It works out great. Now, in this case, we have a very thin blade stock at 90 thousandths, I think it is. And then it has a deep hollow grind. So it gets super thin behind the edge, which matches its ergos because yeah, it's comfortable in the hand, but if it had a thick grind, it would not be comfortable in the hand because the second you start cutting with it and it's giving you resistance and you're trying to push this little tiny handle through dense material, it's going to backfire. So in this case, they made it make sense and it works awesome. Now, two more. Now, you don't have to have it thin behind the edge. If you start off with a nice thin blade stock, you can slowly taper it down to a grind that's maybe a little thicker behind the edge, like the TRM Atom. It's about 20 thousandths behind the edge, which is a great thickness for a knife, especially if it has a tall grind. A lot of Spydercos are about 20 thousandths, but this one starts off at 90 thousandths thick. So because it's such a thin blade stock, kind of like a chef's knife, like we were talking about earlier, it's going to make it very, very slicey. And it's going to make sense, especially when you're talking about a thin, compact handle. Now, you can get good ergos out of a thin, compact handle, but it's also going to make up for the thinness of the handle if it cuts very well. Now, for long duty, let's talk about hard use. Hard use knives. Now, what kind of hard use? That's the biggest question I always want to ask. What kind of hard use are we talking about? Are we talking about batoning? Are we talking about hard use cutting? Because if we're talking about hard use cutting, then it needs to be very comfortable in the hand for long duty cutting, like meaning for a long time, like meaning you're making repeat cuts a lot. And it has to be comfortable the whole time, or as long as possible. Now, the next thing it needs to be able to do is it needs to be able to pass through the materials cleanly, very, very nicely. And the Spyderco Gale Bradley is a great representation of a hard use cutter. Not a hard use batoner, not a hard use prior, not a hard use, anything but hard use cutting. This knife has amazing geometry while keeping a thick blade stock. It has a thick, robust blade stock. It has a tapering spine down to the tip, but then the tip is reinforced by the spine strength. You see the swedge, so it makes it where it's nice and pokey without being fragile. Then the edge is super thin behind the edge, so it slices like a beast. I mean, it cuts incredibly well, especially when you match it up with these nice neutral ergos. So it's going to fit your hand no matter any grip, and it's going to be thick enough to where it's comfortable. And the next thing, it has a nice strong liner lock. No, it's not an access lock. No, it's not a compression lock, but it is a tough liner lock. So, right there tells me it's not made for batoning or anything like that, but it is made for harder use tasks, especially when we look at the steel. And that's a thing I never even spoke about. I probably should have spoke more about it, but the steel choice has a big position in this, or a big spot in this, because the steel is going to determine how tough it is, or how hard it is, so that meaning how brittle it can be. And M4 steel is a very tough steel while also keeping great edge retention. So this is a fantastic representation of a hard use cutting knife. So there you guys go. I love you guys. Thank you guys for watching. Sorry the video is so long. Peace.